Welcome to everybody if you're joining us today. This could be in the morning, afternoon or evening, as we are truly international. If you just bear with us a couple of moments as we allow everybody to join us. Thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by ECIS. ECIS is the Educational Collaborative of International Schools, established for 55 years as a not-for-profit organisation. We have over 500 members in 80 countries. My name is Georgie McIntyre and I'm the Chief Learning Officer at ECIS, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's webinar, and we will be sharing a recording of today's webinar, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions via the chat box. So please feel free to ask questions of Katie as we go through. And I will share them with her at the end. As part of the ECIS community, we have a number of key partners who provide support and services for our schools community, and ECIS are extremely proud to partner with ACER. Please let me introduce our expert. Dr. Katie Richardson taught for a number of years in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, University of Melbourne, and more recently at Deakin University. Currently, she facilitates the Graduate Certificate in Education, Assessment of Student Learning at ACER, and also works as a member of research teams. Dr. Richardson began her career in education as a classroom teacher and a specialist EAL teacher. She's worked in both public and private sector schools and taught students ranging from foundation prep right through to year 12. Her initial area of research was in international education, particularly focusing on international student welfare. The coronavirus pandemic has necessitated sudden and significant changes to educational practices, which have introduced a range of additional challenges for students and their learning. I think we're all feeling the pain and the experience at the moment. This session will explore how teachers can use a range of assessment data to identify learning needs and differentiate teaching and learning for students in an emergency remote teacher environment. Please join me in welcoming and handing over to Dr. Kate Richardson. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Georgie, and welcome everyone. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be with you tonight. Well, it's nighttime here. So let's have a little chat about COVID-19 and the impact that it has on learning and teaching. And the first thing that I wanted to start with is the impact on students, and many of you who are in the classroom will have seen some of this impact on at least some of your students. So we have a number of issues for student learning. So first of all, and understandably, is this stress of learning and this idea that stress impacts on how we think, it impacts on our motivation to learn. And so what we may see in some of our students is changes in their learning behaviour. We also have unfamiliar modes of learning, and so many of our students who are used to learning in face-to-face environments find themselves in an unfamiliar territory, even though we think that they're technological natives. These are new environments for them to be working within in terms of their learning. There's also a greater emphasis on independent learning. And so if students haven't developed these independent skills, help-seeking skills, study skills, and develop the motivation to learn independently, then many of our students are going to actually struggle. We also see that there's an impact of access to necessary technologies, particularly for students from low socioeconomic environments. And so for those students who are disadvantaged, it can mean that they fall further behind in their learning. Another issue that I've come across quite a bit is this lack or limited social interaction with their peers. And as students in school are growing, this social interaction becomes more and more important. And students are really starting to feel this, and particularly in Melbourne here, we're in our second lockdown, and I'm sure, and I know that other places around the globe have had multiple lockdowns as well. And this is something that really can impact, again, on their self-esteem, their motivation to learn, and their ability to understand the information that they're trying to work with. For some students, there's more exposure to stressful situations. And so, for example, for students who are already living in a stressful home environment or are in abusive contexts, this puts them at increased risk as well, which again impacts quite significantly on their ability to learn. So, in online and remote learning environments, what we're going to find is some students who might struggle in the classroom find that this online environment really suits them. They're not distracted by everybody else that's going around, everything that's going on around them. They can adapt their environment to how they like it. But we also have a whole heap of other students who thrive in the classroom, who really learn with that interaction and that constant sort of peer involvement, and they find themselves in remote and online learning and they struggle. Some students may find either environment easy to learn in, other students may find it challenging all around. So that was the students. Let's have a little look at the teachers, and many of you may identify with some of these issues. So some of the issues is this uncertainty and inconsistency of educational delivery. So I know that from my context, where here all of a sudden we were in lockdown, all of a sudden teachers found that they had to be delivering online. They'd never taught online before, having to pull together a whole heap of information for the students that they didn't have to have together when they were doing face-to-face. This rapid change can be quite disconcerting for teachers and difficult to get their head around. There are also new or unfamiliar modes of teaching. Many classroom teachers haven't had to teach online, and so with that, there's a whole heap of unfamiliar pedagogies, a whole lot of understandings around learning and how people learn online that they haven't had exposure to up until now. Again, some teachers may not be as proficient with technology, and this is another hurdle. Another issue that I know I've experienced is working with stressed students and families. And here, in many places, student welfare has had to take priority. And what I've also encountered is a lot of teachers who have borne the brunt of the stress of the families. And so they've had to try and work with all of this while trying to navigate learning and teaching in these very unfamiliar environments. It's a huge challenge. And not only that, but many of us teachers are also experiencing the same stresses and sometimes traumas that the students and their families are experiencing. So I know that in terms of my own family, we've been teaching our children at home, and they've been receiving online and remote learning as well. And juggling work and family all at once can be really challenging. So with all of this, we need information that can help us to tailor teaching and learning to changing needs of students, but also to assist us in how we're going to deliver learning and teaching. Okay, so let's have a little look at what assessment data is. When we talk about assessment data, we're not just talking about numbers, although numbers come into it. We're also talking about words. We're talking about information. What information have we gathered about our students that can help us to plan for teaching and learning more effectively? Okay, so it tells us information about how our students are progressing, but it also tells us how well we're teaching. So if we are not teaching and communicating well, the students are not going to be able to perform well on their assessments. So these are two things that we need to take into consideration, particularly if we're teaching in unfamiliar modes. It's a learning curve. The types of data that we can use to inform how we work is qualitative and quantitative information, as I said before. I also encourage people to use feedback that they've given to students before, because this feedback is a record of the information that you've provided to the students and your suggestions for improvement, and that can actually give you some very good indicators on where to take things next. Classroom assessment. Don't ever underestimate your value as a teacher in terms of what you observe, how you elicit information from your students through questioning, well-designed questions, what you observe as you are assessing your students, and what you observe as your students are working during the normal class time. These are all very, very important because they feed into the context, and we'll talk about context a little bit later. We can also look at professionally designed assessments like the ISA, or here we've also got PAT, and there's a whole range of other commercially designed tests. We'll have a little look at some ISA data in a little while so that I can show you a few ways that I look at data to interpret where students are at. And we can also look at information that we've gathered from online learning activities that our students have participated in. So for example, Khan Academy, here we have Math Space and a whole range of other programs that you can access. So let's think about what information has been gathered during remote and online learning, but we also need to think about what information we've gathered before remote and online learning, because comparing the two is going to also give us information. So what can it tell us? The perspective that I tend to take with assessment is that of, it is a developmental perspective. And so Jeff Masters, who is the CEO of ACER, wrote a very, very important challenge in 2013. And the premise of assessment here is that the purpose of assessment is not so much to judge student success as to understand where students are in their long-term learning at the time of assessment and to monitor learning progress over time. So it's not about seeing how well the students have understood or how much the students have learned. It's about figuring out where our students are, where they need to go to next, and then planning how are we going to get them to that next point in learning. This is a developmental approach to assessment. So when we talk about assessment, we need to make sure that it's good quality and that it can provide reliable and valid information so that we can make decisions that are well informed. So good assessment enables us to detect the extent of knowledge and skill that our students have in different areas of their learning. So if we can figure out how much they know, we then know where we need to start to target learning and teaching. If we don't know how much they know, we're not going to necessarily get it right. We can also find out the extent to which students are able to access the teaching and learning opportunities that we offer. So by this I mean, how much are they able to understand what's going on? How much are the materials that we're offering enabling them to process the information and develop those skills that we're trying to help them to develop? And we also can find out different misconceptions in student understanding. So not only do the questions that they answer correctly give us information, but the answers that they respond to incorrectly gives us information about how we need to teach particular concepts. We can also see gaps in their learning. So for some students, and we see this particularly with our twice exceptional students, is that there will be gaps in their learning. So they'll have an interest in a particular area and great knowledge in that, but very closely related areas may not be quite as well understood. And so we can't just assume that a student is proficient, equally proficient across that entire area of learning. So assessment can tell us where those gaps are and where we need to fill it in. Sometimes assessment can also alert us to additional needs, and as the more I have analysed assessment data, the more I have found that there are particular patterns that we can look for that can indicate that a student may have difficulties in either processing particular types of information or perhaps communicating their knowledge in particular ways. And another thing that assessment can indicate to us is when there are significant shifts in a student's well-being, which is particularly important now during these times. So where do we start? I'm just going to move the picture across, the video across again. So where do we start? What type of information do you need? And in figuring this out, there's a few things that we need to consider. What information have we gathered before this online and remote learning? So what do we know about our students in the face-to-face classroom situations? And how might this inform how we do things in online and remote learning situations? So for example, if you have students who perhaps struggle with processing information, the types of worksheets that you might provide would be relatively plain with not too much to confuse the student. We need to be able to consider these things that we already understand about our students and help them to be able to access those ideas. We need to think about what information has been collected during online or remote learning. So what assessments have you done since then? And has there been a change in their performance between when they were doing assessment in the classroom and completing assessment or activities online? We also need to consider as well, there are some students who may not respond well to particular technologies, and I know of students who have phobias of being videoed. And so if the teacher asks them to put up a video or an audio recording, that can be extremely challenging. And these are things that may not come out in the classroom situation. But they are things to consider. We also need to think about what information we're missing. What kinds of information do you need to collect from the students now so that you can adapt and adjust learning and teaching opportunities for them within this new environment? And also think about what types of assessment data do you have access to? So for example, you may not yet have access to professionally designed test data that the students may have done. If you need to request data from particular administrators, if you need to discuss with other teachers information, do you need to collect more information? What do you need to do? Once we have this information or data, we want to look for patterns in performance, and we also want to look for significant changes in those patterns, because it's those patterns and the changes in those patterns that will give us the information that we need to target teaching and learning more effectively. So what we want to look for is particular consistency in responses. Are the students responding consistently? And it doesn't mean are they getting everything correct, but Are they answering similar levels of difficulty in a consistent way? Are they getting particular types of questions correct or incorrect in a consistent way? Or is it less predictable? So these patterns can often be very much easier to spot in professionally designed tests because of the way that they've been developed, but we can also spot them in classroom assessment. So we want to look for pattern changes, as I said before. So are there significant decreases or increases in the quality of what the students are producing? And are there also behavioural changes? So as they're doing the work, have their behaviours changed? So have you noticed that a particular student used to be quite conscientious, but now they're not submitting the work that they need to be submitting, or perhaps they're not putting the same amount of effort in? So are there these behavioural changes? And that can give us clues as well. So from this information that we've got, we need to identify starting points for learning. And this is what we were talking about before. We're looking at the extent of what a student knows and what they can do. So your data, I also want to flag too, that the data needs to be current. So we don't want the information to be too old because it's out of date, and students can change quite rapidly, particularly as they're learning and as they're growing. So what do we need to look for? We need to look for what the student can already do without help. This is what they've mastered, and targeting teaching to that isn't going to help them to progress in their learning. The next thing that we need to look for is, what are they learning to do? And often the patterns emerge in the data in terms of what they're learning to do, because they'll get some things correct, some things incorrect. Sometimes they'll give partial answers, but not the full answer, and not show that depth of information. So this is where we would consider their zone of proximal development to be. This is where they are ready to learn with the support of a more knowledgeable other, like a teacher, like fellow students, like resources, like the use of resources, etc. And we also need to know what the students can't do yet. And what they can't do is very important, because if we target learning and teaching too high, they will not be able to access the ideas. Okay, what I want to do now is to take a little look at some actual data. And this data has been actually generated for this purpose. So this is dummy data, but it reflects a class of students. This is from the ACER, and what I've done is I've sorted my data. If you're well versed in Excel, you should be able to sort this way. What I start with is the students, and you'll notice that the students are not in order here. What I've done is I've highlighted all of the students and all of their marks and ordered them from the highest scoring student through to the lowest scoring student. Likewise, I have ordered the questions from the highest scoring question in the class to the lowest scoring question. So what we see is sort of kind of two triangles. We have all the ones up to the left corner and coming down, and then diagonally from the bottom right hand corner we have more zeros going up. And so what this shows us is some patterns in learning. And we can also see that there are groups that are emerging within the class. So for example, the lowest achieving 3 students, so student 15, student 3 and student 20, have relatively similar learning needs according to this data. We also see that in the middle there are students with a range of learning needs that are quite similar, and you can see how the ones and the zeros match up. And likewise at the top, you can see that this very top student has only got a couple of questions incorrect, and I'd be interested in seeing how they performed when they did a more difficult test. Now, what you'll see here is you'll notice that some of the students I've highlighted in different colours, and these students have particularly interesting patterns. You'll notice that they're inconsistencies. So, for example, student 10 has this question here, quite simple questions. They've answered incorrectly. We also notice that our student 20 right down the bottom here has answered a couple of questions correctly that are actually quite difficult, but there's a lot of missing information in there. What can we tell from this? We can have a little look at the whole class. We can look at different groupings of the class in general, but it doesn't tell us where their learning needs are at. So we need to split this data up. So what I've done is I've looked at it from different angles. The ISA enables you to look at different processes and how students perform in different processes. So if we have a little look at the process of employing in mathematics, and I want you to particularly focus on student 10 here. He or she is quite interesting. Note that they're right near the top in this particular skill, and they're very proficient in formulating. But when we look at interpreting, they come right down here. And this is what I mean about consistency. We need to look at individual skills and processes to try and figure out where the learning needs are at. And so I would target learning and teaching for this student differently in terms of the first two processes than what I would for the third process of interpreting. We can also look at it from a different angle. So we can look at it from a content angle. And I want you to look at particularly at student 6 with this. And I also noticed that in that student 10 bounces around a little bit too. So student 10, when I looked at the skill sets in the questions that they struggled with, they were having difficulty with interpreting graphs and tables, and they also had difficulty in interpreting and calculating formulas for 3D objects. But student 6, we see this massive difference, and sometimes we do see this in our students where they are very proficient at one thing. So for example, student 6 is proficient at change and relationships, but they certainly find other areas, so quantity, shape and space, and uncertainty in data, very challenging, and more challenging than the majority of the class. So we also see student 1, their results bounce around quite a bit, and also student 7. Student 20 is quite interesting as well. We note that they, in each of these areas, they have come towards the lower end of the class. However, in space and shape, they're reasonably proficient. So it would take some unpacking to look into this and also target learning and teaching according to those needs of the skill sets that you're looking at and wanting to focus on. Now, with analysing the data, we look at different contexts. So as we analyse, we need to understand that any assessment is just a snapshot. It's like taking a photo, a still shot of what a student can do at a particular point in time. And this includes professionally designed tests. And this is why professionally designed tests, the results of the professionally designed tests need to be taken in consideration of the broader context. So we look at this idea of triangulation and what types of information can you look at to check how well these particular tests or assessments reflect what you know about your students. So we look at the skill sets that have been tested, say for example in this ISA test that we've looked at. We look at those skill sets, and then we look at our observations and assessment data that we've gathered from our classes and from online activities, and we see how they match up. This gives us a much more accurate understanding, a much more accurate picture of where our students are at, and particularly individual students. in other words, we can't just rely on the big score at the end of a test, and we can't just rely on one test. We need to look at the whole context. Triangulation also enables us to highlight changes and inconsistencies and anomalies. And so things of concern or interest aren't necessarily going to show up in one test. So for example, if you have a student who has dysgraphia, they struggle with getting their understanding and ideas out through writing, an oral test or a multiple choice test will bring out very different information than a written assessment. And so we need to keep this in mind. If there are inconsistencies, it can actually flag different needs of our students that we may need to actually investigate much further. We also need to think about 3 different contexts. We need to think about the whole class context. Where is the whole class going? How is the whole class moving along? Where are the needs in terms of the whole class? We need to think about small groups and the different zones of proximal developments within each group. And so, for example, we may look at the group of students at the top to see where their learning needs are, which will be different from groups in the middle and from the lower groups as well. There will be different types of activities and exercises, ideas and concepts that the entire class can access, but how are you going to enable each student at each level of proficiency to access those ideas and to work with those ideas so that you bring them from the position where they're at in their learning right through to the next level in their learning where they're ready to learn. And we also need to look at the individual and the individual's contexts. So another thing that I need to highlight is that there is a big difference between analysis and interpretation. And one of the very crucial things to remember is that we do not interpret before we have done a complete analysis. Because if we start to interpret before we've looked at the data, we can come to conclusions that are very inaccurate. So we need to make sure that we have the accurate information first, and we need to also make sure that we know what questions we need to ask. So what information are we missing? So assessment data can't tell us automatically what the potential ability of a student is. It can't tell us automatically how much effort a student has put in or how engaged the student is in the learning. Sometimes a student has put in a huge amount of effort, but it doesn't show through in that assessment. So we need to also be very careful about the types of judgments that we make with this. Sometimes it may indicate that there may be something going on with wellbeing, but it doesn't automatically tell us this. It also can't automatically tell us whether a student is experiencing issues that are due to behaviours or attitude, and it can't, as opposed to other biological issues or developmental factors. So this comes into our understanding of the students' learning needs, particularly for students who have additional needs, and being able to understand whether the assessment or the access to assessment is actually biological or attitudinal. With assessment data, we need to interpret it through a number of different windows. And so we need to look at the students and their individual contexts. And individual contexts, as I've explained before, can have a significant impact on how a student learns. We need to interpret through our knowledge of the assessment and how the students had to interact with that assessment. So what was the content? How did the students show what they knew? What was the environment like when they sat the assessment? Also, what is the knowledge of the classroom dynamics, and this can impact on a student's ability to show what they know and what they can do. Now, the most important thing with all of this is that if you aren't sure how to interpret your analysis of the data, it's really important to ask the right questions and to investigate more, because as you investigate, you can uncover more information that you can then use to inform how you present information and how you get students to interact with that information and skill. So here we have using it to inform learning decisions. How are we going to do that? All right, so we need to consider a few things. We need to consider the type of technology that we're using. Now, remote learning may be different from the online learning, and I know that in quite a number of schools there was a combination of online and remote interaction. So we need to consider how we're actually presenting the information, how we're grouping students. We need to understand how to target the different zones of proximal development that are within our classes. And how are we actually going to get our students to interact and engage? We need to consider the student context. So, ability levels or their proficiency levels sometimes. I prefer to say proficiency levels rather than ability levels, because I like to think of it as not fixed, as students can change and their learning grows and develops. And so we need to keep that in mind. We also need to look at their ability to communicate what they know and can do. And so if they've been in classroom situations where they've primarily used handwriting, how proficient are they at typing now if they are online, and all of that kind of thing. So considering that. We also need to consider the range of ability levels, which is what we've talked about before. So how do we do this? Assessment and analysing assessment is a big job, and it's often best done in teaching teams. So this is an important consideration. You don't have to do it alone. So working in teams can actually be really beneficial. You learn from each other to start with. It enables a deeper analysis of the data. So also within teams, you may have people who are much more proficient at reading and analysing the data, while others may have more knowledge about the student's background and context. And so there's all of these different angles that you can take in terms of discussing student needs. In teams, it provides a range of perspectives when interpreting the data. And it enables a healthy debate, because different teachers recognise different things or observe different things in students. So this is important to keep in mind. It can lighten your workload by sharing it, splitting things up. And also, the whole is other than the sum of its parts. I really like this saying. Working together can spark ideas, innovations, solutions that you alone, or me alone, that we wouldn't come up with. And so working in teams to do this can be very effective. And finally, I think I'm pretty much on time, I hope. Some do's and don'ts, just to sum up what we've been going through. So don't use total scores to analyse student achievement. Make sure that you split it up into different skills to see where the gaps are in learning, where the strengths are, and where students are finding things challenging. Don't assume that because a student is proficient in one area, that they'll be equally proficient in other aspects of that learning area, the subject, the topic. Don't use one assessment to predict a student's potential within a particular area of learning. Make sure, and in fact, we can't tell what a student's potential is. That's unknown, but we can support the student in their learning and support their motivation and engagement. Don't do it alone. That's a really important thing, work in teams. So what can we do? What we can do, as I've said before, is we can split up the assessment data so that we can analyse different proficiencies. We can recognise where our students' relative strengths and areas of challenge are. We can look at their individual skill sets and their conceptual understanding. The next thing is focus on different contexts when you're analysing data. How is the whole class going? How are they going in small groups, perhaps proficiency level groups, perhaps interest level groups? How are individuals going? And take into consideration things like their self-directed learning. And do you need to work on that? Is the assessment showing that you need to be working on developing that self-regulation of learning? Understand the impact that stress and change can have on a student's ability to show what they know and can do. And this is a really big one. And I find that even in adult education, I work with a lot of teachers, that it impacts on even how we teachers interact with learning and how we teach, how we actually show others what we know and what we can do. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind for our students. We need to look for unexpected patterns in assessment, because unexpected patterns often tell us that there is something else going on. It may be a short-term thing that is going on. It may be something that is long-term. There may be other issues that are not transient for that student. So unexpected patterns need further investigation. Interpret assessment data within the wider context. Teachers need to know their students and know them really well, because this gives you the information that you need in order to interpret that assessment data. And that's what I've had for you tonight. Georgie, I was just wondering if there's any there are any comments or questions.
No, there isn't any questions at the moment, but thank you so much, because I know it's actually becoming quite late in the evening in Australia, so you've had your dinner and the day's ended, but honestly that was really, really helpful. There's been so many people here that have sort of, you know, comments and things that we can think about, that I think can take away. As mentioned, we have actually recorded the presentation, so we will be sending that out to everybody who wasn't able to attend today. I think for me, the key takeaway is about trying to understand the impact of change and the pressures and the stress that our students are going under, and how to be considerate about sort of assessment opportunities and what else we can do to support them. I think there's so many other things that we could be talking about around this area, so it is huge. So it would be wonderful if we maybe can offer a follow-up webinar around some of the key areas as well. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or take away, Katie, before we close today's webinar?
I'm always happy to take questions or chat or whatever. So I think Kim and Sarah have put up some contact details for the ISA. And so if you wanted to contact me or anyone about any of this, feel free to send an email to be forwarded on to me.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you so much, Katie, for your time and juggling your schedule to enable us to actually have this webinar today. And we're hugely grateful to ACER for your contributions. And we will also be sharing this out via our sort of various channels as well. Have a good evening, and a pleasure to be working with you. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.